My name is Dan Wagner, and I will be introducing our speaker, Professor Henry Levin, today. This is the first of our spring speaker series in IEDP and Grad School of Education. And I will speak louder. Thank you, Winnie, for that encouragement. It is a particular pleasure to introduce our speaker, Henry Levin, today. He is a person who I have followed over, I would say, decades, and a person who finally moved to the East Coast. I'll give you a little bit of his biography in a moment, but who's done some of the most important work in the field of international education and economics of education, and broadly speaking, educational research globally. He's currently the William Hurd Kilpatrick Professor of Economics and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. There are a lot of things that he has done. I just want you to know his CV is 33 pages long. You are getting the brief version, but I think it's important in some cases, like this case, to get a sense of a career. So I'm going to give you a quick sense of this. But a quick sense in his case is still a little bit longer than usual. So bear with me. I think it's an interesting path. He still remains a professor emeritus at Stanford, where he taught for almost, I guess, 30 years, I think.
31 years, yeah.
33 years.
Yeah.
He also was director of a major school reform initiative called the Accelerated Schools Project. And people who know his work in the United States will know that project, and maybe be less aware of the work that he has done globally over many years also. That particular project tried to improve the education of at-risk youth in 1,000 schools in 41 different states here in the United States. So it was a huge project, a very important project. On the international side, he's had Fulbright professorships in Barcelona and Mexico. He's on the visiting faculty at Peking University, and an honorary professor at Beijing Normal University. He's been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences on the West Coast and the Russell Sage Foundation. He has honorary doctorates from Monmouth College, Maastricht University in the Netherlands, National University of San Marcos in Peru. He's been editor of one of the leading educational journals, Review of Educational Research, and been president of the American Evaluation Association. He also was president, and I voted for you, for the Comparative and International Education Society back, I guess, about 8 or 9 years ago. As I said, he's a specialist in economics of education and human resources. He has, for those of us who are in academia, we like to think we've done a pretty good job over the years, but he has over 300 published articles. I could teach for quite a few more years, and I would not get to anywhere near that total. So, but I think that having then had a chance to browse the 25 pages of publications, I thought I would just mention a few in from sort of recent to older here, give you a sense of what he will be talking about today from these examples. So, and again, you know, there are a lot of these, but just to give you a sampling, in 2007 with Brookings Institution, the price we pay, economic and social consequences of inadequate education, a topic that, of course, concerns many of us. And another one, a few years before that, a book, Cost Effectiveness and Educational Policy. Back even, doing the calculation here, 25 years ago. Is that right?
Possible.
Approximately. Effective schools in developing countries. Schooling and Work in the Democratic State back in 1985. And then I'm going to jump back. I thought it would be fun to see what his first papers were. And they date, and we were talking a little bit over lunch about the 1960s. You were publishing in the 1960s. You may not remember that. You were probably a toddler. But interesting paper, which I had never seen before, What Difference Do Schools Make? A topic interesting, and that was in 1968. And so today we'll be talking really about some aspects of the same issue. And then just for something different, in 1966, and I don't know where you were at this one, at this stage, but an analysis of the economic effects of New York City's sales tax. I thought I'd just throw that in to show that he is capable of doing something outside of education. But of course, most of a career involved in trying to pursue analytical ways of looking at how to make education better. We'll be hearing about that today, his most recent work on the topic of transforming international education for changes in the workplace. So a big welcome to you. Many thanks for joining us, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thank you. So just so everybody's aware, Professor Levin will take about 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. I'm always very wary about introductions because the first time I went abroad to do some work, professional work, it was in the country Venezuela, way before Chavez, way before Chavez. And I found myself figuring out how to get from the hotel to the building, and the building to the offices and everything, and was very proud of myself because I hadn't studied Spanish and had just picked up enough to be able to do that. And I get to the office, and there are 4 or 5 gentlemen in the office, well-dressed, and apparently the head of the office, which was the Division of Planning of the Ministry of Education in Venezuela, came out and grabbed me and shook my hand and gave me a hug and said, "We're so happy you're here." And then he continued. He said, "Because you're like Columbus." And I knew enough Spanish, Cristobal Colón, to know, and right away, you know, when no one explains anything to you, you say, well, Columbus, wow, they're really putting me on a pedestal. Because, you know, as little children in the US, we learned that Columbus discovered America. Well, he discovered the island of Hispaniola, and in fact, there were indigenous populations living there, so he didn't exactly discover it. He certainly wasn't the first person to discover it, but anyway, knowing that, I thought, what an honor. He discovered America, and they are seeing me coming to Venezuela as representing Cristobal Colón. He continued. He said, Columbus didn't know where he was going, did he? And so I played the dummy, you know, like with the ventriloquist. And then he said, and when he got there, he didn't know where he was, right? And he said, and most of all, you're like Columbus because you traveled here at government expense. Okay? So I have to start off by telling you, I don't think I traveled here at government expense. Okay? I want to talk to you about a subject that I've been delving into, I've been concerned with. It's only a partially developed subject, but in some ways those are the most interesting because you're more likely to find surprises as you continue to look at them. And that's this whole question of, in a world where work is changing, where a lot of things are changing, how should we think about education in that kind of situation? So I'm going to talk to you about a number of topics related to that. First, how are workplaces and employment changing? What are the new educational needs? How should we prepare educationally to meet economic changes in the workplace? And then some alternative strategies. And this is not one of those tight presentations where I have answers to everything. I think I raise more questions and have some directions that we might pursue for answers. But they're worth talking about, discussing, and challenging. Okay? Well, again, this is the shorthand approach because each of the topics I'm going to discuss really has extensive musings and literature and so on. But what is the changing context of occupations of the future? And you read about these all the time. You've read about the sharing economy and Uber and a whole range of developments. Well, we are seeing a lot of economic change, especially Europe, Africa, and Asia, but also in the US. And we see changing country patterns of growth and trade, the so-called BRIC countries, Mexico, and so on. And we see big changes in technology. We see changes in products and services. It's not just the technologies, but the actual products and services that are being produced. And in the organization of production, the sharing economy, normally we might think of that as something at the consumer end of the business, but in fact, we're now seeing the sharing economy describing the production of goods and services. Uber is, of course, just one example of that. Now, I want to remind you that the traditional planning model for education and the economy was one of very fixed assumptions. When I started, for example, the OECD had a model which they called the Mediterranean manpower planning model. That's the term they used. Instead of people, power, men and women power, they called it manpower. So don't feel that I'm totally insensitive. I'm giving you the words that were used at that time. And in fact, if you were to look it up, if you were to look up people power, you won't find it in this context. So you'd have to look up the OECD manpower model. And basically what it did is it said, what kind of output do we want at some future time? And whatever that means, whether it was a desired output, and it then divides that into sectors. So much more production and transportation and finance, in particular those were manufacturing days, and so they would talk about particular industries. And then they might just say, well, we want to see a 10% growth in output, and we'll look for 10% growth in everything in each of these areas. And then they would say, well, what does it take to produce these kinds of increases? And they would look at the fixed relationship between people employed by occupation, and they would set out, we need so many architects, we need so many welders, so many, and so on. It depends on the particular country how detailed they got, but in some cases they got very detailed. And then what they would do is say, well, what educational levels and other requirements for occupations are needed? And usually they would take either the legal requirements for the occupation and or the average amount of education that was associated with the occupation from their statistical from their statistical basis. And then they would plan changes in the educational system. How can we transform educational capacity and content to accommodate the new requirements and to produce the needed qualified graduates? Now, we don't use that term qualified graduates in the US very much, but it's used around the world quite extensively. When we say, is this person qualified? We're saying, has that person met the requirements typically for the license at the higher education level, or some other criterion at a lower level? So that's a kind of a strange word that we use in the US, because it's a very formal word in terms of qualifications. In the US, qualifications have more to do with whether the person can perform the task, has had experience in doing this kind of work, and so on, than the idea whether they have a degree in the subject. You know, in Latin America, for example, there are probably more persons with degrees in architecture, meaning qualifications in architecture, that are teaching in secondary schools than there are people doing architecture. But if you ask them, what is your occupation? I'm an architect. And we find that very strange in the US, because if you're not doing architecture, how can you be an architect? You know, so these words have different meanings in different contexts. The concept of qualifications is still very much used in Europe, and it certainly is used in Latin America and perhaps other areas of the world as well. Okay. This approach utterly failed. It produced too many people with certain kinds of education, too few people with other kinds of education. And what we learned is that in those days, when occupational transformation and transformation of industries and economic activities was at a much slower pace than it is today, that even a decade of making projections came out very, very badly. And the problem is that even over a short period, we couldn't predict the changes in work requirements. And today, what we're saying is there are rapidly changing technologies, workplace organizations, and people, fortunately, have more than a 10-year horizon. They typically have 40 to 50 years of working life. And so what we really need to talk about is a much longer period of time where even 10 years would be inadequate, and yet we failed even at 10-year projections of so-called occupational and educational needs. And the best example of this is what was called the Mediterranean Project of Manpower Planning of the OECD in the 1960s. I know that that's like the Middle Ages for you guys. And it led to massive forecasting errors. It was actually used to plan education, and it led to massive errors and very, very serious difficulties in labor markets, shortages, severe shortages of certain kinds of labor, and huge surpluses of others, okay? So we go back to some basics and we ask, what does education have to do with labor productivity? And this is just a very quick review. If we look at the economic literature on this, we know that in the 1960s, human capital became a major concept in economics, kind of a parallel with physical capital, plant, equipment, and the idea was that you could invest in either one. There had been a bias in terms of, gee, if we really wanted to grow economically and do well, we have to have more capital, physical capital, plant, equipment. And the so-called human capital revolution of the 60s said, no, we can improve economic growth through investing in human capital, in education, in training, in health, even locations of the population. And these are alternatives. And by investing in education, we can increase basic skills, and we can increase productivity with these skills, and worker output and quality will improve. And the question is, which of these sectors, physical versus human capital, do we invest in? Well, we have a criterion called rate of return, and what we can do is to examine which one of these seems to have a higher payoff in terms of additional productivity, and invest at the margin in that one. And we can kind of try to equilibrate the returns to each of these by making proper investments. Okay. There were a lot of assumptions behind that, and I won't go into them. I will say that the expectations of investment in human capital in terms of economic growth and productivity at a national level varied immensely. And we can go into that later perhaps in terms of why. But at the same time that human capital, the theory of human capital and its applications were developed, we started to see that there are other forms of human capital done, for example, through both deliberate training programs, and also through learning by doing. That if you employ people in particular situation, they learn by doing, and their productivity rises in that. And we also found that educated workers benefit more from training than less educated workers. So there's a connection between kind of basic human capital and the ability to benefit from training. The last part, and this goes back really just to the 70s, was that there's something else about educated workers that we want to consider. This is associated with T.W. Schultz, in particular, one of the Nobel Prize winners, one of the real pioneers in terms of human capital. And the assertion was that educated workers can make better resource allocation decisions. It's not just that they can do the work at a faster pace, more accurately, as we might think of productivity, but they could actually process information on alternatives, on the consequences of alternatives, perhaps even on the cost of alternatives, and make decisions that improved the functioning of the organization, so-called resource allocation decisions, and they could adapt to change at a much faster rate. So that if new technologies come in, if new forms of organization arise, that educated people have those additional abilities beyond training, beyond the skills of just a particular job or a range of jobs. It extends to the organization itself. And Schultz made a special point of saying, this is where we can really benefit. Now, interestingly enough, the first, human capital, focuses essentially on basic education. You could define that by a society up to grade 8, for example. The benefiting from training, one might say, builds on those skills, but also on those at the secondary level. And this is just a rough way of categorizing, but the third group of skills are heavily embedded in higher education and post-secondary education because they require conceptualization skills. They require being able to make connections between activities that you're not doing and the activities that you are doing. So I just want to mention that there is something in economic theory behind this, and a lot of this has been tested in particular ways with some interesting results. But underlying a lot of this is the notion that the more education you get, basically the higher your test scores. And even at any given level of education, there are differences in test scores and in achievement. And test scores are considered one measure of skill. Look at all the attention to PISA, for example. Why should we worry about PISA scores except the assumption is that they have consequences? And indeed, Hanyashek and Vosman have even made the argument that they're the main drivers of economic growth. I disagree with their analysis. I'll go back to that later. But research does show that test scores are related to worker productivity and earnings. So we don't want to deny that. Study after study shows a relationship, whether at the micro level, that is looking at individuals, or looking at aggregated units, that there is a relationship between test scores and various measures of economic productivity. But here's the important point that we sometimes forget. The relationship is surprisingly modest. And just to give you one measure of that, in the US, the number of years of educational attainment explains about 4 times as much of the variance in earnings as do test scores. That is, if you know a person's educational level, and you also know the test score, which one will make a better prediction of a person's earnings? By far, the amount of education that they have. And this has led people, in terms of the early literature like Bowles and Gintis, to say, you know, there must be something about what is learned in school beyond what we measure in these achievement tests that accounts for this. And they even tested this in early studies, and they found that if you knew a person's level of education and you added to that achievement, you only reduced the explanatory power of educational attainment, level of education, by about 20%. That is, roughly speaking, 80% of the earnings differences among education levels hold on even if you add statistically information on achievement. And I might tell you that's been replicated in recent years. That was replicated about 12 years ago, looking at all of the data sets that we have. We have far more data sets than when they originally did the study. Data sets that contain educational attainment and test scores. And that finding seems to hold up very well. That about, if you look at just the return to a year of schooling, and you look at the return to increases in achievement, that about 80% of the returns to schooling hold up even after you've adjusted the data for the test scores. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, and it certainly should stimulate some thought. Well, why is educational attainment so powerful in explaining productivity? And the answer is generally given by these particular explanations. Students learn many cognitive skills not covered by the limited way in which we measure student achievement. We measure student achievement over limited test domains, limited methods of measurement, and therefore these measures that we put so much stake in, in some countries, for example, one test or one set of tests really determines your future in terms of whether you can go on to university, and in some cases, which universities you would be eligible for. It's not your curricular activities, it's not your grades, it's not any one of this broad set, but it's just basically one score determines that. The second problem is that educational attainment, that is just simply the number of years of schooling, imparts non-cognitive skills. We learn other things in school that are not measured by achievement, but they're important for worker productivity, such as conscientiousness, self-direction, effort, interpersonal relations. We could make a much longer list for which there is some evidence, and then there are even longer lists where there are logic connections between those things, but we don't have good empirical data yet. So it's clearly much less settled. It's much more difficult to get at precisely which characteristics. The relationships might be more complex in terms of how they affect behavior and productivity. But the idea is that we do have some empirical evidence, and we have a research program that we want to pursue. Now, it's interesting that even in 1966, Ed Phelps, who's also a Nobel Prize winner, had a very short article in the American Economic Review in the Proceedings, and in it they tried to emphasize, he and Nelson, education is especially important to those functions requiring adaptation to change. And that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on what does that mean? What are the implications? And is that true? Well, change is what we will face continually in the 21st century, and rather than educating for narrow occupations and rigid qualifications for roles, I'm going to argue that we have to educate for adaptability. Okay, let me talk about that word qualifications. The traditional qualification approach assumes that each job has specific qualifications that are reasonably stable. Educational qualifications, perhaps other qualifications that can't be measured educationally. A lot of former jobs required a certain amount of brawn, for example. Okay, Well, we don't measure that educationally, but those could be requirements. And in many countries, the education laws require that the training embody these qualifications for official recognition of a title. And by law, public employment and much of private employment by association is based on official titles more than the actual capabilities of different workers. You can be a great economist, for example, in Venezuela, but you will not get into the Colegio de Economistas if you do not have the license in economics, the license being the university degree in economics. And in the US, if a physicist does brilliant work in general equilibrium theory, we call that person an economist. We don't care what the degree is in. So that gives you that contrast between calificaciones on the one hand and how we think of that term in terms of worker characteristics. And I want to emphasize that it influences the private employment in these countries. Big firms use the same criteria in these countries in terms of qualified labor, what they call qualified labor. But these qualifications tend to be fixed over time, and there are a number of reasons, the most important being that they're established by law. And when you establish something by law, it carries a certain sacred meaning that you better take them seriously. And they don't change laws every year. They don't reconsider, gee, what has happened to technology, what has happened to work organizations, how the industry is organized. The assumption is that all of these things will change very gradually, sometimes not even over a lifetime, so you don't have to worry too much about them. And information technology, one of the things is it's reduced transaction costs, and that has really changed work organizations in terms of, you're all familiar with the offshoring of activities, but internally, organizations, because of the reduction in transaction costs, that is, costs basically of information and other kinds of contracting costs and so on, don't find it as advantageous to have a system of production that's stable and fixed, and in fact adapt to opportunities that occur in the marketplace, including, again, Uber is a good example, including what we see in our own lives in terms of the sharing economy, offshoring, and so on. And so organizations are adapting with much greater decentralization and flexibility, and the question is, what should workers do? What kind of education should we emphasize for workers to adapt? Keep in mind, over a 50-year period. We're not talking about just what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years. In the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to have driverless cars. There's no question about it. There's still some obstacles to doing this, so that even the Uber type of organization may become obsolete. Who will need drivers? So one of the paradoxes, the existing taxi drivers in our cities are all, around the world by the way, are all organizing against Uber. They should be organizing against the concept of driverless cars. When I say they should be, in terms of their own interest, I haven't really analyzed that very closely, but in terms of their own interest, they should be. And so what I'm going to argue is that we really need to think about a transition to a more balanced system in which education for qualifications is balanced by education for adaptability. And before going into that, in Europe, you have a movement of universities to get unification in terms of qualifications. It's not working very well. In Italy, they believe that the preparation of architects must be what the Italians have licensed. After all, Italy has very good architects. In Spain, same thing, but the requirements for the license overlap only slightly. And Spain has good architects too, Calatrava, for example. And so the emphasis on unification in terms of the so-called Bologna agreement is not moving forward very rapidly. Each country believes that its qualifications are the ones that are required for occupations. And yet, the changes that are taking place in organizations, technology, goods, and services, and so on, are happening around the world, and not just in so-called developed societies, Europe, North America, and so on, but literally around the world. And so what I'm emphasizing is, what are the requirements for adaptability? Now, having said that, I don't have solid answers. I think this needs much more investigation, but it does require thinking in a different way from what we've been doing and what we've done in the past, okay? These are some of the suggestions. We need a more child-directed education than a focus on a narrow curriculum. We need greater emphasis on interpersonal and intrapersonal development. We need more emphasis on modes of knowledge acquisition than on memorization. And we need greater focus on acquiring and applying a knowledge base as needed. Because we can't predict what kind of knowledge base we're going to have to travel with all our lives in order to be productive, effective, and so on. So what are the educational goals for adaptability? Well, again, these are just suggestions, but there is either a logic connection or actual empirical connection, or both, of course. Initiative. This is very important. Cooperation. And I want you to notice that virtually none of these are measured directly by achievement tests. If you go to PISA, we may actually get at this a little bit more. For PISA 2015, which is the next version of PISA, it will come out at the end of this year in December 2016, I think you're going to see some exploitation of various kinds of student attitudes, if they are good at it, if they are good measures. Have to remember that Angela Duckworth here, wonderful psychologist who's really been pushing the frontier on these fields, has raised questions of whether her measure of grit has the meaning that either people think it has or that it was intended to have, because it's self-reported. And all of these measures in PISA are self-reported by students, okay? And self-reported measures are very tricky. They're subject to gaming. They're subject to social interpretations of what a good answer is or what a bad answer is on the measure. And so Angela, to her credit, as someone who's made a huge investment in developing the concept and measurement of so-called grit, I'm sure many of you have heard of grit as an additional measure, has raised the important questions herself about her own work, which is great, because then you can move on and try to see how you can overcome that kind of challenge. Peer training, evaluation, reasoning, problem solving, each of these we could talk about, but I want to go over a list. And I emphasize a list. It's not the only list. We could expand the list. We could contract the list and say that there's overlap in categories. Decision-making abilities, information retrieval and use, planning, learning skills, and in a world of mass migration as well as international expansion of international trade, offshoring, and so on, multicultural skills. Okay. Now, even if we can resolve this and work on this, we need to work on it. And it's not something, as you look at changes in education around the world, You will see changes in terms of, are we teaching students, for example, to keyboard, to understand basic programming, things like that. So you see changes in subjects, additions to the curriculum, but essentially the idea is, can we use technology to teach reading better? Well, what kind of reading? That's the larger question. How should we consider reading in terms of an adaptive worker, one who can adapt to things we can't predict now? We can't even set them out now and say, these are the things that are going to occur precisely. And now what we'll do is we'll prepare people for those things, you see? So I would argue that as I look around the world, I'm not an expert on everything going on in the world by any means, but I have done work in a number of countries and stay in touch with a number of countries and have a lot of occasional contact with people working in a lot of countries, and I would argue this has not yet been on the agenda for education. What I'm particularly concerned with is, as countries seem to have adapted, not to this concept, but have adapted to the importance of PISA scores, or the importance of international comparisons in achievement. There is something to be learned from them, don't get me wrong. But should that be the sharp focus that we should be concerned with? And what I will assert is that training is becoming more general because these changes sweep industries rather than being restricted to firms. So that's something that we have to keep in mind because it has some important policy implications. Employers are reluctant to train people for industry changes because those people can seek employment elsewhere. And if you, in the traditional Becker analysis, if you charge the employees for training, then they're going to be reluctant to go to a particular firm and get a lower salary while they're being trained, when they're being trained for an entire industry. They're being trained for large changes. So employers themselves have little incentive for investment because it's easy to lose someone who has general training that can be applied across many industries. And Peter Capelli, right here at the Wharton School, has made some very, very impressive claims, saying the fact of the matter is that there's a movement towards just-in-time workers. His argument is that based on what we know of employer training programs, they've been cut way back over the last 10 to 15 years. That is, employers are making a lot less investment. And then they complain that they can't find enough good workers. When in the past the idea was to provide the specific training that you need and to simply try to get good talent coming in and to train people yourself, because the emphasis was more on specific training for the particular firm than for the industry. And he argues that that has resulted in complaints about the quality of potential workers because firms want just-in-time workers, or they give a little training. They'll give a week of training, whereas in the past the training requirements that they established were much longer. So that raises some interesting questions, that even if we can solve the problem of adaptability, what is an adaptable education? And I can tell you it's just the opposite of an education where you memorize a curriculum. So if you want to think in those terms, this does not mean that you do not need a knowledge base. So we're not arguing knowledge-free education. But the knowledge base should be there for understanding, for application, for improving ways of thinking, making decisions. A lot of the list that I showed you before And it raises the questions not just of education for adaptability, but how will we prepare workers to apply those skills in particular jobs and particular firms. Now, one possibility is that the government will provide incentives to firms to provide kind of training, and we're seeing some of that in the U.S. now. In the U.S. now, we've reawakened about apprenticeships. Those of you who are interested in this should look at what South Carolina is doing. South Carolina, produces BMWs. They produce a lot of fancy foreign cars, so to speak. How do they do this? If you look on average at their test scores, they're terrible. They're among the lowest. They have high dropout rates from high school and so on. But what they've done is they've tailored training programs in both the schools and in the firms to be more like, they're not exactly like the German apprenticeship model, which is a very stylized model that, at least it's argued, it's the basis for Germany's success in exporting, in machine tools, and in so-called mid-size firms that Germany has. But they have some of the same characteristics. A second possibility is for the industries themselves to get together and for industry associations to receive funds from the government as well as from their own members to train and certify workers for the industry. A third is to have the industries even set out their own requirements or, quote, qualifications in the U.S. sense, what workers need to know, what they can do, and also to retrain and recertify. But the underlying emphasis is in creating a system that can support adaptability to both training and to work. So what would we conclude about this? Again, I'm leaving an open agenda, and that's intentional because we don't have the answers to all of these, but if we shift from a direction that's probably unproductive to one that's productive, we're more likely going to be able to develop and discover ways of moving forward. First thing is promoting the continued expansion of education. And I can't think of anything at this moment that would say, no, don't do that. Don't expand enrollments, don't expand accomplishments, don't expand your measure, don't expand your ability to improve success, and rates of return in economics of education suggest that that's a very, very important direction to go, that there's a large return for expanding education and more inclusion in the society of expanded education. As I've mentioned, we need to move towards worker adaptability, and I think we have to develop the concept more fully, its applications, ways of pursuing that. And then we have to be concerned with the education of immigrants and those from low-income backgrounds. These are very underutilized population, and there are actually countries where they may be the solution to these problems. In Europe in particular, there's been very slow growth in terms of population, labor force, very low fertility rates. Of course, the same is true of Japan. I mean, we could single out countries that face this. And they need to be concerned about the education of those who enter the country, the refugees right now, we read about the plight of the refugees. We don't read as much about the opportunities that, if we think big, the refugees represent in these societies, because now the focus is on the cultural differences and the emergencies that are faced and the ability to absorb in a much more basic way these. The other thing to keep in mind is that these populations demographically, they grow faster than the populations of the countries they go to, and we need to raise their productive participation. And that's a serious challenge in the foreseeable future. There are a lot of institutional challenges. We need to de-emphasize the search for new and rigid qualifications, and we need to seek more general skills with applications learned on the job. We need to get a balance between occupational qualifications and adaptability. And we need the financing to provide incentives for on-the-job or industry training to use skills productively. Having said all that, trying to set a direction perhaps for the discussion, I want to say thank you very much, and let's just open it up.
So we do have time for questions. We also have 4 designated speakers who have little red cards who I'm going to call on relatively first, but I'm going to do something a little bit unusual because I feel like I have a pressing question. So I'm going to start with my question, a broad question, and that is, to what extent would you be able to give the same talk in very different countries? So let's just say you're in China, you're in the US, you're in a rural South African university, you're in Highland, Peru.
Yeah.
Same conversation, different conversation.
Well, in China, I would start off by saying, Ni hao ma. And I would proceed from there. But having said that, I did actually present a version of this. It was somewhat different in China in November 2012 at the Beijing Forum. And it was published, I think, in the following year in the Peking University Education Review in Chinese, okay? And they published it, I believe, as their lead article because they thought this was a very provocative direction to go in. What is likely to happen in other countries? Okay, my own experience is limited to, you know, the countries that I work in. We live part of the year in Spain. My wife is Spanish. And so I've had a lot of opportunity to discuss this in Spain. I participate in their economics of education meetings each year. And in general, I haven't had any great opposition at this point. Maybe I need great opposition in order to rethink or to move in some other directions. But at this stage, people are willing to listen. They're willing to think about this. I think it scares a lot of people because it suggests that no, it's not just a matter of getting better teachers. It's not just a matter of a smaller class size. It's not just a matter, you know, of the fairly traditional ways that we try to improve education. And people are afraid of breaking away what they're used to.
Yes, just to pursue this, I would have thought that if you were giving this talk in sub-Saharan Africa, that they'd say, look, we're having such a hard time even getting students into universities following the curriculum, getting kids, half the kids are dropping out before they even get into secondary school, and you're talking about adaptive skills, you're talking about, in a way, 21st century skills.
Yeah.
How should I, as the Minister of Education of Uganda or maybe Peru even, how should we be thinking about this for the populations in our country which are having a hard time? What would be the kind of
Well, I would start off trying to persuade them with the economy. Now, Africa in recent years has had 4 or 5% growth rates. Peru at the same time. But all you have to do is to kind of unpeel the covering, and you'll find it was because of the high price of commodities, and particularly China being the buyer. That is, what they haven't done is developed effective infrastructure. Now, it varies from country to country. Nigeria, for example, has been developing services, but they're still very dependent upon oil, and there's a lot of conflict over just general issues without even talking about the educational issues. If we were to go down country by country, we would find that the countries actually who have had the most success in the last 5 to 10 years have succeeded because they've been in a good place with respect to commodities. And what we would want to do is to say, is that your vision of how you want to fit into the world economy in the long term? At least you'd want some diversification. And one could argue that a lot of the commodities, for example, coal, iron ore, I'm thinking of Brazil here, which is also had a wonderful trajectory and now not so good. And again, if you look carefully, commodities, soy, various kinds of commodities. So that's where I would start off. And then, of course, there's the second stage, which is how to do that. How should we think differently about this? I think to some degree, we do have some models. I think that India really has a lot of different economies, all the way from really very difficult peasant types of agriculture to the urban poor living on the street, all the way up to fairly high growth in technology-related industries. And I think if we look at those technology-related industries, they have done a lot of training themselves to try to make workers more flexible, almost working against the rigidity of Indian education. So there's a huge agenda, by the way, so I present this to you as a huge agenda to think about and to ask how should we go about developing this. The big message is that adaptability is going to be very important. How do we do it? How do we incorporate it into education in a meaningful way? And that has a lot of micro problems because I don't think we're going to get a lot of support from traditional teacher unions.
So that's a good answer. I'm going to leave time.
Sure.
I'm going to take 2 of the red cards. And why don't you just say your name, your program, and your question. We'll take 2 in a row. So these 2 right here. You want? Sure, stand up. And because we're going to try to catch it on video too.
My name is Levin. I'm from the IEDP program. I think I can say for everyone when I say I really appreciate your talk and we learned a lot from your talk. My question is about comparativeness of education. So right now a lot of countries, they like using PISA and other type of standardized tests because it allows for international comparability. But when we focus on education to adaptability, different countries may have different definitions or different priorities in terms of adaptability into the global economy. Then, with that, is it possible or is it necessary to do international comparison of education across cultures? Or do you think with globalization, there's still a universal standard for adaptability?
Okay, well, great. Let's just take it. There's a lot there. So,
well, I don't see one world model of education. I see transformation that fits cultures, that fits the other differences among countries. So I really don't think that the PISA model, even though it's very attractive because we're also imbued with the idea that test scores are high, we're all imbued with the model that, wait a minute, productivity is based on skills. Skills are measured by test scores. Those with the higher test scores win. Certainly that hasn't been the case. In fact, I don't want to be egocentric and talk about the US, but let me do it just to give one example. If we go back to 1983 and the Nation at Risk report, which some of you are familiar with, that was a report that said the US is rapidly losing its educational productivity, its skills productivity. Other countries have moved up very fast, and we know that all the statistical measures today comport with that. The US, if we go back to 1983, I believe that this is approximately correct, the US had the highest participation in post-secondary education, had the highest outcome in terms of high school completion, just a couple of little things. We were troubled because since 1965, when the International Education Association started its comparative stuff, we were in the middle of the so-called developed countries. And we use the word mediocrity. That report used the word mediocrity all the time, just about average. And here are countries that are rising above us in terms of the development of their educational system, the outcomes of the educational system, and it won't be long. Okay, 83, that seems to me to be about 33 years ago, quite a while. What do we know? Well, what we know is that the US labor productivity, even though we complain about it all the time, especially in recent years, is still the highest in the world. How could that be? Every testing regime since then in comparison shows, have we really improved? Did Nation at Risk really just stimulated us into doing some things, foolish things in some cases, good things in others, but it sure didn't move our position on the test scores. Let's talk about Japan. Up till 1990, Japan was doing really well economically and had some of the highest test scores in all of these studies. And that was one of the focuses of Nation at Risk. Countries that had higher test scores and that were doing well and that were going to surpass us. Well, as you probably know, Japan has had basically no growth since 1990. It's 26 years with some of the highest test results in the world. Japan, by the way, is pressing very hard to get changes in its educational system. 1/3 of the curriculum is supposed to be autonomous. Turns out people are afraid to, and the unions are not excited about changing the curriculum, so you don't really see a change in 1/3 of the curriculum in most schools. They still hold on to the traditional curriculum. But the important point is, what is that relationship with those test scores and at least these economic outcomes? And it's not at all predictive. This is also true of the Hanushek-Wussmann thing. They put much too much emphasis on test scores, much too little in terms of capital per worker, changes in organization over time. They ignore completely the non-cognitive measures, which are, as we've found in many cases, well correlated with the achievement measures. So the achievement measures can also be just a proxy, or at least heavily a proxy, for non-cognitive or social and emotional, whatever you want to call those things, for other things. But the thing is that we have belief systems that these arguments fit into, that we have to do better on the test, and that the countries that do best on the tests are going to have the best economic results, and so on.
Well, they certainly do get a lot of media attention. Stuart?
I think this would be a decent follow-up.
And your name and program?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Stuart Rudy, and I'm in IEDP as well.
Maybe you could stand so people can hear a little bit.
And yeah, the camera then. I'm sorry. I'm Stuart Rudy. I'm in IEDP. And my question, I know that, there's kind of two parts. I know that economists are often reluctant to make policy suggestions just from their research, but there are clear policy implications in your research and the presentation you gave today. So my question actually has two parts, and I'm wondering first, how receptive are policymakers to the suggestions of academic researchers versus, let's say, their own ideologies or their political base, both in the US and internationally? And secondly, what can school districts, teachers, et cetera, do in the absence of policymaker efforts, assuming that there is probably pretty big challenges in actually getting policymakers to implement change?
Well, I think that, let me deal with the second question first, okay? I think getting these things on the agenda and trying to get educators to understand that they have a right and an obligation to discuss these things, to debate these things. Most educators, in my experience, aren't on that agenda. What they are is dealing with the reality of what the new laws are. We have a new national, federal law of education replacing No Child Left Behind. And they will get involved in coffee conversations and in other ways, and in their formal meetings, talking about things like that. But they lose sight of the fact that they have a right and an obligation to talk about educational policy in the larger sense. So that would be my answer. Now, as far as policymakers, the problem that I see is this, that who are the policymakers? We've never defined that very well. Are Congress people, assuming that the Congress actually works? Okay, let's make that false assumption. Economists are willing to make assumptions all the time, okay? But assume that the Congress works. What are the kinds of things that they can that they can approve? Well, they can approve all kinds of macro formula types of things. But when we begin to talk about these kind of changes in the US system, because of the high degree of decentralization, they've got to be decided at schools, school districts, and maybe the states can have a bully pulpit, and maybe even the federal government, and Arnie Duncan. I'm not saying Arnie Duncan because he certainly used the bully pulpit in a very different way. He basically reinforced the traditional way of thinking about schools. But there can be bully pulpits at various levels, but then it's got to really influence people. The action has to be taken where the education takes place. In response, I already said something bad about Nation at Risk. I said that there was a lot of change, and a lot of it was foolish change. In California, for example, we were very impressed by Nation at Risk in terms of saying that kids go to school 6 days a week, they go to school more hours, more weeks per year, in Germany, I think in France, in Japan, and so on. And people even made statements like, at the end of high school, the average Japanese student has 3 more years of education than the average US student. You know, that's simple arithmetic. Thank God they remember their arithmetic so they can add up all of those marginal differences. But it had an influence on the states. The states, without looking carefully at how time is used, about what the issues are, in California, what we did is we raised the minimum school year from whatever it was to 180 days a year, as I recall. That was $250 million at that time, because California is a big state. Even at that time, it was a very big state. Is that a thoughtful way of spending another $250 million? It's easy to do at a legislative level. And so the report really had influence on a certain group of policymakers. But in a way, it was the wrong influence. They were simple solutions. I think you all know what H.L. Mencken said about simple solutions, or you may not. And I'm not going to give you the quote, but they're usually compelling, they're usually persuasive, and they're always wrong. And that really is a paraphrase. If H.L. Mencken were still alive, he wouldn't be very happy with that. But the point is that what we can legislate, what we can simply do, is usually not something that addresses the issues. And that's true in other countries as well. And then there are the politics. Organized labor, a lot of it is very sincere about wanting kids to do well, but they're mainly organized not to look at adaptability and figure out how they can get it in, advocate for it, talk to parents why it's important. You know what their agenda is. It's different. And I'm in favor of organized labor, by the way. I'm very distressed at the present Supreme Court challenge, okay? But having said that, that serves a different role. We've never really adapted that to the kind of professional thinking and advocacy, and we just haven't. So I think those are some of the challenges that we face when we have to do it. We have to, instead of saying, gee, but they really want us to consult on how we get more technology into the school. Well, we know how that worked in Los Angeles. That worked by wasting about, I think, $1.3 billion on iPads and curriculum Pearson that they had never developed but had promised. But there's money in that. So in a sense, we're the same way. We have to say, what we've learned in my profession as an academic is this. And let's debate it. Let's discuss it. It doesn't mean I'm absolutely correct. But those conversations are taking place among us, people in this room. They're not taking place among the people who are making policy every day in schools, and they're not taking place between academics and those groups.
Okay, we have another question over here.
Hello, Dr. Levin. Thanks for coming to speak with us.
Name and program.
My name is Tyler Hallmark, and I'm with IEDP. And when we think about the adaptabilities model, idea that we're talking about, a lot of people look at social emotional learning as the way to develop these non-cognitive abilities. But as we know, some of these SEL programs can be kind of expensive to implement, especially for schools that are already strapped for cash. So I was wondering, as we move to this assessment of adaptabilities, how do you think these social emotional learning programs would impact socioeconomic disparities?
Mm-hmm. This is truly, how do I think about this, rather than, am I an expert? Have I done research on it? What have we found? Let me talk very concretely about something that I have worked on, though, because I think that there's a parallel. As you're all aware, students who are entering post-secondary education today are found to require remedial education, developmental education. Perhaps in the US, half of all students have to take remedial education, developmental education, okay? How is it done? It's mostly done where we repeat, essentially, the courses that the students failed in the past. What are the consequences? The consequences are that most students don't even get through the remedial courses. They drop out very quickly, realizing that people like them aren't going to succeed, okay? Now, when we look more carefully at why they're not, and by the way, we have a center at Teachers College called the Center for Community College Research Center. And so you can find the publications that talk about this at that center. Why is it that they're not succeeding? Well, if you look more carefully, it has a lot to do with the social and emotional learning. We call them study skills. Time management, skills like conscientiousness, which is one of the so-called big five. If you looked at that's very important in explaining educational outcomes. But there are a whole list of things that are necessary for educational success. Much less attention is paid to them than is paid to the direct, we'll teach you pre-algebra, we'll teach you algebra. You know, you have to get through 2 or 3, and then you have to succeed at algebra, and if you're going to be able to enroll for credit-bearing courses in the community college. But we do very little really on, there are study skills curriculum. They're not very well developed. They're not really premised very well on why it is that these kids don't have these skills in the first place. And so my guess is, it's just a guess, that if we were to do more in these areas, we would actually, it would be an equalizing policy, let's put it that way, in terms of the results. Now let me just mention one other thing. In the town that I came from, in fact I was the president of the school board, Palo Alto, California. Some of you might have read in the Atlantic about 2 months ago of the suicide, the high levels of suicides and clusters of suicides. Those suicides were not among disadvantaged or whatever you want to call students. They were among the most advantaged students. Very good students doing very well and so on. And they were throwing themselves, we have a train that runs through town, Caltrain, goes up to San Francisco. So sad, they were throwing themselves in front of the train. So today, if you go to Palo Alto, at the 2 major grade crossings, you have police there after school at the crossings every day because of the seriousness of the suicide problem. I don't think it was because these students were doing badly academically. In fact, the evidence we have is that that's not the case. But there were other things going on in that environment that, had we paid more attention to social and emotional learning, when I say we, I've been away from there for 20 years, okay? But we, all of us, should share some responsibility for making sure that our students are well served, okay?
I think Darren, and then we'll open it up more broadly.
Thank you for speaking.
Could you stand up and introduce yourself?
Yes. My name is Darren Temmel. I'm also with the IEDP program. With regard to student-directed learning, you have mentioned student-directed learning. Do you believe that there are existing alternative education approaches that capture student-directed learning? For example, like the Montessori method or the Spider School method? Or where do you believe that student-directed learning is happening now?
I think both examples that you've mentioned do provide student-directed learning. I think that there are a lot of alternatives, but some may be better than others. The word is used very broadly. In education, for example, a lot of people use the term constructivist on the basis that if you use constructivist principles, that's essentially student-directed learning. On the other hand, if you go all the way to project methods, there are teachers who believe you just let the student pick a topic, start to do research on it. The student doesn't need structure or guidance, and where the student ends up is up to what the student does. So the question is, where do you need structure? Where do you need to have openness? Every student wonders about things. That's great. Wonder is really, really important, because if you wonder, you're going to be curious. Too many of our students are not curious, and student-directed learning needs to capitalize on curiosity. But if we say this is the curriculum, doing the opposite, this is what you have to learn, this is how it's going to be measured, and the students who memorize best and spend the most hours on it are going to do well, guess what happens to curiosity? It just fades. You don't even have a right to be curious. So you lose, in a sense, the ability and the experience to see how wonderful, how beautiful for learning is curiosity. I don't want to say any more about this. This was at the heart of our Accelerated Schools project, where what we wanted, not just students who test really well, but all students to have an enriched learning environment where they could build on the things that they come with, and this was one of them, curiosity.
Could you, we're going to open it up, I saw some other hands, but just take one more minute and tell us what happened to the Accelerated Schools project. You were just talking about it again. What's the sequel? Where are we now relative to that?
Well, for me, it's a very sad story, because we started in the early 80s, and it was going along very well through 2000. As you mentioned, we had about 1,100 schools in 41 states, and we had schools in several foreign countries, including, by the way, Hong Kong. We had 50 schools in Hong Kong, or 45, and then we had 5 schools, it was a secret, in Shenzhen province. That's over the line in the PRC, in the People's Republic of China. And what happened was very simple. It requires schools to get together to use the principles of accelerated learning and gifted and talented education for all children. It's not formulaic. That means that the school, it's more than the teachers, the school has to use what time is made available outside of regular instruction or find ways of getting more time to develop the approaches that they're going to use and the curricula that they're going to use and training and so on. And in 2001, there was new national legislation, No Child Left Behind, and to make it as short as possible, No Child Left Behind set incentives for schools, strong incentives, to basically teach the test. Also, to get kids to graduate without truly meeting the standards that had been set. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with credit recovery? Okay. It's a joke, and it shouldn't be allowed. And it's another way of putting something over, claiming that we're making great strides with children from low-income backgrounds and minority backgrounds, when we're not. At least we're not in that direction. So, it's a way of finding alternative ways in which they can get credit for a course. Today, it's become a whole industry, private industry, in which it's done through the internet. And they have a few weeks in which they're taught what the questions will be, what the answers are, and then they're tested on that. And we don't even know if they're taking the tests because there's very little security involved. So the teaching to the test became the way of resolving NCLB. And that meant that principals who were also under pressure, I'm not blaming any one individual, it's a system, simply hired Pearson, it's one of the companies, to provide materials and training to the teachers on how to put everything in test format, how to teach the test, and so on, and they dropped completely any, let me call them higher order goals for the school. And that was pretty universal across the country. It's not one city, one school.
So not a happy story. Okay, others, Emily, say who you are.
I'm Emily Hamm. I'm in sociology and also affiliated with IEDP. I was interested in whether you run across, either developed in your own work or run across in other recent research, kind of promising approaches for gathering information about the degree to which students are experiencing adaptation-oriented learning, or whether schools are offering that kind of learning. And I guess I'm selfishly sort of particularly interested in whether you have run across approaches, sort of instruments or questions that could be asked in survey format, or relatively sort of non-intensive, large-scale data collection approaches.
It's such a great question that I don't have a good answer for it, because we have not been doing work at the school level on this particular topic. My guess is that there's so much variety going on in education that you will find outliers that are doing something really interesting on this. You will find individual classrooms. I think that's even more likely, where suddenly you say, wow, you find out from a parent or a student, and you go and you say, my God, this teacher, but then the teacher will tell you that he or she has pressure from colleagues to stay with the regular curriculum. It's a system which, as you know, is heavily culturally imbued with what should be done and what being a professional is and all that. And that's a little bit hard to modify, but not impossible. I don't want anyone to think that we should give up. No, don't. Work at it. There were some in the back. There.
Other in the far back. Introduce yourself. Maybe stand up because you're far away there.
How are you? My name is Daniel West. I'm a student in the IEDP program as well. And I had a question about, you mentioned moving towards assessments that measure non-cognitive factors such as adaptability. You listed about 7 possible traits that make up the adaptability. And you listed also several of the benefits toward moving towards such a system. However, what will be some of the drawbacks, or what particular populations will be mostly affected by moving towards such a system, with adaptability being, as someone mentioned earlier, such a subjective term? What would be the consequences or some of the implications for the populations that didn't fit into that country's or that system's adaptive, adaptive definition? What are we looking at, and what are some of the strategies, if at all, if those have been considered towards mitigating the risks that these populations will face?
It's another great question that I don't have a ready answer to. I don't have a packaged answer, but I can say this, that I think that there's a lot of promise in good early childhood education. A lot. I mean, we see this, for example, in self-regulation. Self-regulation is an important part of adaptability. Being able to make your own decisions as opposed to responding only to external forces. And I think it fits in with adaptive education because it's basically one in which the person has responsibility for assessing a situation and responding to it, instead of being guided by only external forces. So I think in the early childhood education, I would like to see more good early childhood education taking place in countries that lack it.
Levin? Yes? Stand up.
My name is Greg Collins. I'm in the Ed Policy Program. As I listened to your presentation and heard perhaps a dichotomy between curriculum qualifications, focused education, and an adaptability focus. But I listened to your observations about NCLB and the response, and I think on my own engineering undergraduate education, I wonder whether it's not more about the delivery system. Do you think this is a true dichotomy that we have to pick one or the other?
Well, I'm not fully sure that I understand your question, but let me just say, given my understanding, content is really important. You know, structure is important, there's no question about it, but content is also important. And if I were to design a school that started on building in concepts and development in terms of adaptability and learning, what I would do is want to consider both. Want to work both on methods and on content. The example that I gave of curiosity, that's a big one for me. Curiosity. It's so wonderful that our children come to school and how does this work that way? Why does it work? What? And we put all that stuff aside and say that that's not what the curriculum is about. The curriculum is about you have these letters in the alphabet and we put them together in a certain way. You can make some sounds out of them. And if you make sounds out of them, you can put them together in words and wow, you're able to decode now. Well, that's not unimportant. That's a tool for learning. But should that be something that then shunts curiosity, which is also, I mean, emotionally, if you're curious, you already have an incentive to find out, to learn. And what I want to do is to show every child that whatever you wonder about, you have the right to learn about, and these are the tools to do it. Including, of course, the magic of the internet and how to use the internet to learn, because there's a lot of garbage on the internet as well. So, you know, it's a different way of thinking about the issues. And that's what we did in accelerated schools, by the way. And if anyone has curiosity about that, I can always send them articles and stuff so that they can see. Not to try to convince people, but just this is what it was about. This is what we tried to do. This was the logic model underlying it. It wasn't just flaying out, something. But there's a logic to it.
So I'm going to ask the last question then. You used a word just now, curiosity. I don't think I've ever heard an economist give a talk that used the word curiosity as sort of a content area, and I've also rarely heard economists talk in the kind of humanist tradition that you were talking in. I wanted to ask you, since most of us in graduate school here, or on campus here at Penn, what's it like to be a humanist economist in a field that is so much dominated by econometrics, by mathematical formulae? You did not throw up any beta signs on the screen or formulae that we should be taking into account. In fact, most of your talk was really about, and you talked at lunch about John Dewey and others, even Carlos Castaneda, a throwback from the old days. Do you feel that more comfortable in the area of education and people who work in schools, or equally so with people who are economists of the more mathematical variety? Is there some reflections you have on that to share with us?
Well, in any trade, and I think economics is a trade, as others are, what you do is you learn what makes you proficient and how to present yourself as being proficient. And values are not a big part of that. Values will get you into arguments, that's true, but they're not a big part of evaluating who you are as a human being, because people are evaluating your trade. You're a carpenter, what does your work look like? How well have you done? Not what is your philosophy behind your work, and people are the philosophy behind my work. And all I can say is the thing to look forward for all of you is aging. As you get older, these issues become important issues, particularly if you're curious. And so you suddenly realize that the things that were important to you when you were younger and the way you were evaluated, and you accepted that kind of system, that while you don't discount them completely, they're not the entire picture. There's a much bigger picture out there. And if you can connect with that larger picture, you will experience a much nicer aging process than if you try to stay with the more narrow parts of your learning and on which your occupation evaluated you.
So we take from that also that the personal is also the dimension of your talk today on being adaptable and adaptability and change over time. And maybe with that, did you have a?
I do have one question.
All right, short though, because we're just about wrapping up.
I was just wondering, thank you for coming, Professor Levin.
And you are?
Oh, my name is Sarah, and I'm in IEDP. How you feel you're maybe able to encourage curiosity or include these adaptability skills in your own teaching at Columbia with your students?
And my honest answer is it's always a compromise. There is a canon, not that someone else has told you you must teach, but there are some things that we feel that students must learn because they're important, and even if they're going to learn them because they disagree with them, it's important to know your enemy instead of having pretensions about the way your enemy thinks and what the values are underneath. So I would say that there's always a compromise, but I feel comfortable enough, and have for a long time, to be clear on what I believe and think. And I try to do that not in a preachy way, but just to be clear that maybe I'm foolish, but this is the way I think about this problem. But it is a compromise. I mean, there are some things that I don't think are that important that I teach, because if I'm going to prepare someone to, quote, have qualifications, they really need to know that. I can't just take the entire curriculum and make it the way I see it, the way I think. I don't feel I have that luxury.
Okay, well, thank you for that last question, and thank you very much for a most enlightening.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Good afternoon. Anybody wants to say hello to our speaker now? It'd be a good time.
Anyone want to help me retrieve the USB?
Yes.
That would be helpful.